The linguistic landscape of modern Scandinavia forms a map from which we orientate ourselves in time and space. The continental North Germanic dialect continuum covers most of the landmass, with the Uralic languages Sami and Finnish in the north and east respectively. This map, with some slight shifts over the centuries, has endured since at least the earliest medieval sources, and you can see a continuity reaching far back. But the further back in time you go, the sparser the sources become, and the lack of knowledge makes it harder to navigate the ethno-linguistic geography of Scandinavia. The Nordic languages, as we know them today, begin to approach their modern forms around the end of the Middle Ages. A strong Low German influence, grammatical leveling, and dialectal sound shifts began to stabilize after the ravages of the Black Death. The non-Germanic languages that were spoken in Scandinavia, like Finnish and Sami, are only sparsely attested at this time, and Finnish wasn't established as a literary language until the Reformation, in a form that was already fairly close to the modern speech. Old Norse, or with a wider label, Old Scandinavian varieties, like Old Icelandic and Old Swedish, is the most well attested of the historical older language of the early medieval sources. The Old Norse dialects ancestral to modern Swedish and Danish that we find in younger runic inscriptions and medieval laws differs greatly from their modern counterparts in both vocabulary, phonology, and in particular grammar. Modern Icelandic, and to some extent some peripheral dialects like Upper Dale-Carlian, preserved some of the medieval features, such as noun case and verb forms, better, but they have also changed greatly over the hundreds of years. Old Norse, in its various dialects, is one of the most well-attested and studied Old Germanic languages, but when we venture beyond that period, the sources, and in turn our understanding, decreases, and the depth of time makes itself felt. Going beyond the early medieval and late Iron Age periods, the more unknowable things become, and when we go beyond the earliest runes, we are left with nothing but silent objects and mute remains. The first people of Scandinavia came along with the receding ice, but when we are that far back, what they actually spoke is pure speculation, far removed from any attested speech, and their genetic and cultural relation to modern peoples is most likely minor. The time between the modern Scandinavians and the Vikings is a fraction of the time between the age when the first hunters and in turn farmers settled the woods and marshes of ancient Scandinavia, as the land slowly rose from the weight of ice. We have to begin in the other end, from the later documented languages, limited foreign sources, and most of all, comparative linguistics, to clear the primeval fog, to gain an idea of what was spoken in Scandinavia before the late Iron Age. The name Old Norse sounds very old and creates association to something ancient and original. But looking at Old Norse in its historical and linguistic context, that is not the case at all. It's more the lack of earlier sources, probably combined with pop cultural fascination, that has yielded a warped impression. Old Norse is actually a medieval Germanic language that, along with related siblings like Old English and Middle High German, derive from a far older language stage. The medieval Germanic languages are the result of far-reaching sound changes, such as umlaut and strong phonetic reduction, centuries before the literary forms were established. The oldest runic inscriptions in the Elder Futhark show glimpses of this ancient Germanic language, and in turn, how the medieval languages were about as different from it as they are from their modern descendants. Comparing Old Norse forms with Proto-Norse or even Proto-Germanic shows just how strongly the Germanic languages changed in the centuries following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the Migration period, or what was used to be called the Dark Ages. It's through these short and few runic inscriptions, and comparative linguistics, and most importantly, the distantly related East Germanic Gothic language, that we can reconstruct the oldest Germanic speech, as it was spoken in the Iron Age. Proto-Norse and Proto-Germanic differ greatly from later Germanic languages by having far more unstressed syllables, and in turn a more developed inflectional morphology, which we can see in other old Indo-European languages such as Latin or Greek, and still today in Baltic languages such as Latvian or Lithuanian. Using these methods, we can gain a fairly clear picture of the language that in time would develop into languages such as Swedish, At this point, we are in the Iron Age, around the same time as classical antiquity in the Mediterranean. To move further back in time, approaching Pi or Proto-Indo-European, we reach pure reconstructions and we can easily get lost in both time and space. What the ancestor of Germanic looked like in the Bronze Age, when the culture of Scandinavia was quite developed, is of course pure guesswork. But it's reasonable to think that many of the features that distinguished Germanic weren't as developed and the language was more similar to other Indo-European groups. But Germanic is a branch that is known for having quite distinct developments, in particular with verbs and consonants, which suggests a long separate development from other Indo-European branches for quite some time. But this was hardly the only language spoken in ancient Scandinavia. Germanic is, as said, an Indo-European language, which limits the time period for its arrival to Scandinavia. Most date the arrival of Indo-European speakers to Scandinavia with the accorded ware culture around 2000 BC. Around the same time as city-states had developed in Mesopotamia in the Fertile Crescent, such as the Sumerians, meaning that this was much later than you might think. Studies of ancient DNA also suggest that most modern Scandinavians largely descend, both genetically and linguistically, from these fairly recent settlers from Eastern Europe, which of course means that there were already cultures living in Scandinavia before that spoke their own languages, and most likely some time well after that. Linguists have studied the vocabulary of Germanic, and some of the words and concepts, with many relating to agriculture, seem to derive from some older non-Indo-European substrate. The cattle-herding pastoral Indo-Europeans picked up these words, like goat and clover, presumably from farmers from Neolithic Anatolia that settled Europe before them and brought agriculture with them from the south. But what about the other languages, Finnish and Sami? It might seem a bit odd, but Sami is in many ways a more changed and evolved Uralic language than Finnish, compared to their ancient common forebearer that has been reconstructed. Proto-Sami underwent considerable vowel shifts and absorbed a large number of loanwords, thousands of words, from an unknown language spoken by the ancestors of the Sami. The Sami are thus probably descended from an older people that adopted a Uralic language, maybe for practical purposes such as trading, and a large portion of the vocabulary, in particular reindeer herding and the local landscape, still bear witness to the lost language, or languages, since the loanwords seem to derive from a source with considerable dialectal variation. Proto-Sami also borrowed many words from Proto-Norse. Worth considering is also that these words were borrowed from around the same time as the substrate words based on chronology of the sound changes, meaning around the 6th century. In other words, an unknown Paleo-European language, presumably spoken since the Stone Age, was still alive with native speakers in Lapland as late as the early Middle Ages. Sami people also have been known to live further south historically, meaning that it's not far-fetched that this language once covered a vast area. Finnish, which is often highlighted as being a very conservative language, has likely been spoken in a very long time in Finland. Much like Sami, Finnish also has a large amount of ancient loanwords, but in this case, most of all from Germanic. Being a quite conservative and phonologically stable language means that Finnish preserves these loanwords in the hundreds in a form as they were spoken thousands of years ago. Words like kuningas, rengas, and the place Harjavalta gives a glimpse of what words like king, ring, and the name herald once sounded like. But the exchange is thought by some to have gone further than just words. Some linguists see clear connections between phenomena in both Proto-Finnic and Proto-Germanic, such as the consonant gradation in Finnic and Werner's law in Germanic. Strong parallels to how the languages once developed suggest that the speakers lived nearby one another with a close linguistic and cultural contact, as shown with the numerous ancient Germanic loanwords. Some enigmatic words, shared by both Germanic and Finnic, are by some attributed to earlier cultures, such as the word seal, that was possibly borrowed from a lost hunting culture that lived in the Baltic region. What we face as we dive into linguistic time depth of ancient Scandinavia is a shadowy and dim map, where ancestors to modern languages and groups share archipelagos, forests, fields, and moors, with for us completely unknown cultures lost to time. If we were to travel to what is now Stockholm in the Bronze Age, which was then an open archipelago with islands extending out to the sea, we would maybe find Indo-European dialects on their way to something resembling Proto-Germanic, perhaps in close contact with Proto-Finnic, but maybe also something else, of which we know very little, such as the speakers of Paleo-Laplandic or the tongue of the seal hunters.